Hey everyone, it's Jackson, and before we start the episode, wanted to let you know that Cabin has officially opened co-living at its first neighborhood at Neighborhood Zero outside Austin, Texas, which you've heard about on the show. And if you're interested in long-term co-living at beautiful locations with nature out the front door, high-speed internet, actual campfires, and unlimited sauna use, you could sign up today by visiting cabin.city. Spots for neighborhood 0 are extremely limited, but there will be other neighborhoods that we will add soon across both the country and the world. And move-in is as early as October 1st. All right, here's the episode. Hi, everyone. This is Jackson Steger, and you're listening to Season 2 of Campfire. Let's get it. This season of Campfire seeks to understand how to build new cities. Each week, we are joined by experts and practitioners from different startup cities who will share the stories and lessons that they have learned from experimenting with radical new models of living. Cabin is building its own network city and co-living brand, which you can learn more about by visiting creatorcabins.com or by following us at creatorcabins. You can also visit cabin.city. After a few months of doing this podcast, I've noticed, as I'm sure you have, the emergence of this sub-industry within real estate and city building, and that is holistic neighborhood development. And I tweeted as much after recording the episode that you're about to hear with today's guest, Joel Anderson. And Joel is a neighborhood builder, which is just an amazing thing to be, something that many of us, including myself at Cabin, aspire towards. Joel is currently leading the development of a project called West Village, which is a new development district in downtown Florence, Alabama. He also writes the Jambalaya Substack that explores new kinds of urban environments. In today's conversation, we discussed how economic development has changed across American towns. Our cities, big and small, now compete with each other directly for people, whereas before they may have tried to attract corporations and industry rather than the people themselves. Our cities are competing on an international landscape now too. We also discussed two projects that he's helped to steward, including Remote Shoals and West Village. All right, enough of me talking. Let's all listen. Here's the episode, and let's get it. Well, Joel Anderson, welcome to Campfire. Excited to have you.
Thanks very much for having me, Jackson. I'm excited to be here.
So I want to start just talking for a second about you. And you've done a lot of really awesome things. And just to sort of give the audience a sense of where you're coming from, what is the common thread that ties your career or professional life together?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm from a fairly small town in Alabama. The region's about 200,000 people. And growing up, I was just so excited to leave and get out of Florence. That's the name of the city where I live, and get out of Florence, go see other places and, live somewhere for a while. And I did that and enjoyed the new experiences I got. But as I was away, I started to realize hey, there's something really special about the community that was in Florence. There's a really, really strong community. You kind of, know a lot of people, everyone knows each other and is really friendly. And I just wasn't never found that anywhere else. And so that kind of prompted me to think about, well, maybe I should consider moving back there. And ultimately made that decision when I kind of realized that today, most of the career opportunities that at least I wanted to have or was interested in could be accessed through Twitter or through email and things like that, and through Zoom, rather than through having to live in a specific city for a specific job or employer or anything like that. And I would say that's kind of the common thread that's tied everything together and has really fueled all these kind of experiments, both with economic development, but also with real estate, is that idea that people can now choose where they want to live and choose where they want to, how they earn an income, completely independent from one another. And that's just an unprecedented change that, it's going to take a long, long time for everyone to fully realize the implications of that. But I think the coolest thing about it is it means people can think about this, rather than being tied to a specific city because their employer happens to be located there, that maybe the first job they got out of college or whatever. They can be very deliberate about, oh, I'm looking for something very specific. I'm looking for a very specific type of community, and I can, move to wherever that is. And so that's a really big unlock. And I think the real estate side of it is there aren't a lot, in my opinion, of really good communities in the United States today. And both from a planning perspective, but also from an affordability perspective. There just aren't that many places that are both pleasant to live in and affordable for, the average or the median person. So that's the thread that's like really fueled all this, is people can now, practically choose where they want to live, or effectively choose where they want to live. And we need to build more communities, I guess, to support that and to give people what they want.
Yeah, the trends that you're describing are ones that I've very much lived. And yeah, let's talk about cities for a second and kind of their function in society, because 50, 70 years ago, if I got a job at Ford Manufacturing, like the reason why I'm in Detroit is because I work for Ford, and Detroit itself is kind of organized around this larger industry of like producing cars at the time. But now, like the job I work, the job that many of my friends work is location agnostic. You don't even have to be in the US unless maybe you're in like health tech, and then like the data server location matters. So as the use of, or as the like remote work trend and other trends increase, what is the point of cities? Because I think there still is one, but maybe you can help us articulate what that is.
That's a really, really good question, and really interesting to think about, because, like, to your point, cities have always primarily functioned as labor markets, and that's been the driver of practically everything that goes on in them. How they grow, how good their transportation networks are. It's all kind of in service of this greater idea of like, people come there because they can earn a better living, they can access a better life simply by being in proximity to that city and everything it offers them. I don't necessarily think that the cities as labor markets are or idea is really going to change. I think if anything, remote work just changes, like, I guess, kind of the scale at which it operates. Like, so I think about it, before there was really no upper bound to agglomeration effects in cities. Like, the more people you put together in one city, the more stuff was going on, kind of the idea that some of those particles are going to smash together and produce something interesting. What I think remote work kind of unlocks is a new, I don't know the exact right word for it, but almost like for that process to be a little more deliberate, and for those communities to be a lot smaller, which is really, really conducive for humans to live in a kind of like smaller but, close knit human scale environment, but to be oriented around either a specific purpose or a specific set of shared values, rather than simply, hey, let's try to get as many people in this particular metropolitan area as we can and squeeze as much efficiency out of that as we can. So I think, in more concrete terms, what that could look like, could be communities that are set up for either with a deliberate mission, like, hey, all the people here either work kind of in the same industry, or are trying to achieve this one mission. You can make it up and say it's going to Mars or whatever. But I think that's a really interesting approach, because then cities are still doing all the other things that they need to do, like provide housing, provide food and energy to their inhabitants, but the reason people are there is a lot different. So that's one of the interesting, like, kind of threads that I keep trying to pull on, is like, what could a more intentional kind of community look like?
Sure. Yeah. I think also you'll now see that as more and more cities realize this, the dynamics of how they operate and what they're designed to do will change. So now, like, I think cities aren't just competing with other neighbors, they're competing against every other city in the US for remote workers. And with that, actually, like every other city in the world, Estonia, Prospera, who we've had on this show, there's plenty of examples of like the international competition for like talent, for lack of a better term. So like you wrote, cities are moving from providing the minimum services necessary to still extract tax revenue to now using all means possible to attract new residents. And I know that you've also led a program on this. So yeah, what can cities do to attract new residents? And then maybe within that, you can introduce remote shoals.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I think existing cities absolutely have to really evaluate how, to use a startup term, how compelling of a value proposition they are to people who don't yet live there, because cities have never had to really think that through before. They've been kind of able to, collect tax revenue, again, from those people who are there trying to access the labor market. But once those people are kind of completely untethered from that and completely free to move to any city they feel is right, you naturally see people start to compare cities on the basis of, by far the most common is cost, because people are being priced out left and right of the largest and most expensive cities. But there are also other amenities, like how walkable and bikeable is it, pedestrian friendly. Like how many, I saw a funny metric the other day that was like on Twitter that was like, how many non-chain restaurants per capita does it have? So like kind of like how good is the food scene is that metric. And you find that college towns score really, really high on that. And college towns are actually, becoming really popular destinations because they're still quite affordable, but they're kind of used to new residents coming in all the time because they have big universities in them. But they still offer all the things that people want. They have like lots of good restaurants and nightlife and things like that. They're just not millions and millions of people. That's actually the scenario that my city, Florence, is in. Is we have not the biggest, but the fastest growing university in Alabama is here, and it's a very like kind of cool and hip place. I feel old just saying that, but it's an attractive place because it almost not in spite of, but because of the fact it hasn't grown throughout most of the 20th century. So I think I've kind of taken on that role with some other folks and looked at it and said, okay, what uniquely does our area have to offer that other areas don't, or what basis can we compete on? And we created a program called Remote Shoals to offer a $10,000 like relocation incentive for anyone with a remote job who wants to relocate here. Because for the local economy, it's a no brainer versus trying to incentivize big industrial manufacturers and that kind of thing. But what we found is it's been really successful. We've had several thousand applications, but most people are like, hey, I heard about your community through the program, but I'm going to move whether or not I get accepted to the program or whatever. Like the $10,000 is pretty inconsequential in the grand scheme of things. But because of the program, I learned about your community. It told the story of it, showed kind of like what the community is like there, what it's like there. And so I'm just going to move anyway. So that's been kind of a pleasant surprise. But I think it points to this bigger idea that people, if given the option, a lot of people, not everyone, but a lot of people are going to look at, hey, if I don't have to be in New York anymore or San Francisco or Chicago, then I'm gonna move somewhere else. I'm gonna, sell my $1 million condo and buy a much bigger house for $300,000, and I'm gonna pocket the difference and retire early or whatever, whatever you want to do. But
Yeah, I remember, I think it was 2019 where the Amazon HQ2 hunt kind of really accelerated and then concluded. And I remember reflecting like two years later as I was looking into programs like Remote Shoals for myself, how that like Amazon HQ2 hunt was probably the last time that cities competed for corporations rather than directly for talent itself. Correct me if I'm wrong there, of course, but I looked at a lot of these programs and they're really cool. Like there was one, I think it's in Arkansas, that offers you like 10K and a mountain bike. I'm a big biker, so I thought that was fun. There's a Morgantown, West Virginia one that offers $12,000 in cash plus $2,500 of outdoor recreation credit. And so like with each of these, like I imagine it is a large project to steward and to sort of like convince people is a good idea because it is so different from the ways of the past. So my question for you with like Remote Shoals, I have many, but my first one is, how does one build a coalition to make a program like that happen?
yeah, well, so I have to give all the credit to an existing organization. So I was kind of actually found the idea through Tulsa Remote. Or Remote Tulsa. They were the first program I saw that did it. And I was like, hey, I see what they're offering. Like that makes a lot of sense. Why don't we do that? And I had recently joined the board of an organization here that's like our regional economic development authority. So it's a publicly funded organization, but its job is to recruit industry to the area. And it was organized kind of back when all the manufacturing was going overseas, and we lost a lot of that in the area. And the initial reaction to that was, hey, we need to get that back. And they've done a lot of that through the years and sometimes successfully. But now I think when I joined, I kind of looked at it and said, well, isn't it almost better to incentivize individual remote workers, because you don't have the risk that the employer closes overnight or goes bankrupt and you have 600 unemployed people overnight. which has happened before. Everyone is working for a different company. There's a diversified kind of tax base there. You don't have to worry about it. So I pitched the program to the board, but it's been the administration of that organization that has put it all together. Two people in particular, but they've overseen the whole thing. They do all the interviews for remote shoals, all the like visits when folks come here, help them find housing, get them plugged into the community, all that. So I wish I could take more credit, but I was absolutely I have not done a lot of the work, I guess I should say.
Sure. Well, yeah. So shout out to those folks and to the folks in all these programs across the country doing it. What, like, obviously the intent is to attract new folks to the city. I think even your program has like, yeah, you can't be from like this county or maybe even the surrounding counties either. But how do you say you are successful in attracting new cohorts of people to the city? How do you think about retention and keeping them there?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and something we monitor. So we've done our first couple cohorts now, and we've seen how many folks stay here. And we considered, if you can be above 50% with a program like this, then that's already kind of a net win. We've seen it with a relatively small sample. It's like 85 to 90% in the first two cohorts. So, but the third one's a lot bigger, so we'll get some more data there over the first couple of years. But what we found is people, and we're very open about this, we understand people likely don't make that decision, kind of overnight, especially if they've never visited the community. So what we've kind of assumed most people want to do is to move here for 6 months or a year and kind of try it out, see what it's like. And if they, at the end of the period, kind of really like it, then most of them go on to purchase a home, some rent. But that's, as an aside, that's the biggest bottleneck by far to this program's growth and the growth of the community overall is housing. We can talk more about that in a little bit, but yeah, retention mostly comes down to how kind of well do folks get plugged into some relevant, community, not organization necessarily, but some kind of like some network in the area that they can relate to and that they enjoy being a part of. But we found as long as folks do that, then this area, there's really good feedback as far as like, it's so funny being there because like I'll be in a store and like not even the person who owns the store, but just a random person will be like, "Oh, can I help you find something?" It's just like it's a culture shock for a lot of people, but in a good way where people are just kind of surprised by how nice strangers are, I guess. So we found a lot of folks have found that element like really, I guess, charming once they're here, and then that makes them want to stay or at least consider staying.
Yeah, it's almost like the southern charm of Alabama is one of your competitive advantages in the marketplace.
I like to think so.
I'm curious, like, so this regional economic development entity, I, could you, for the audience and for me, share what is the intent of economic development? How has it changed other than this remote work piece from the 20th century to the 21st century? And I'm like asking this with the intent of then asking you what the right kind of ownership is, but just to sort of let you get there on your own.
Yeah. Well, as I've learned, economic development is extremely broad and deliberately so because it really depends on the type of community and the type of industries they're kind of intent on attracting. In a lot of areas, that has a very like kind of clear answer or natural answer. Like we're very close to Huntsville, Alabama, which is a big kind of aerospace and defense community. And so I don't know details on their economic development kind of group, but I would imagine a lot of it is focused on, okay, how do we build industrial parks and industrial buildings for these defense contractors? How do we build, or office parks for them or whatever it is?
Yeah, great example. Like I saw the same thing in Houston when I was there for a health tech conference. They have basically these two huge industries. The oil and gas industry is propagated by being close to the Gulf, but then also they have like the most dense health hospital hub in the country. And so much of like I went to an economic development presentation in downtown Houston and it was all dedicated to like those two industries. So yeah, appreciate you providing that example. Just wanted to have another for sense of scale.
Yeah, for sure. And I would imagine a lot of places, maybe do it for certain types of office space and things like that. Economic development agencies will often build out like spec buildings and things like that, with the idea that if a company is kind of interested in multiple sites to locate like a manufacturing facility, the easiest one for them is going to be the one that has kind of like a ready-made building with plenty of power, and they can move in like in a month and start operating rather than take 2 or 3 years to plan and build something. So that's a lot of the activities, but only if they're in that kind of like manufacturing or distribution kind of economic development.
So, with that as context, you've written about something that you call the right kind of ownership. So, what is the right kind of ownership as it relates to our cities?
That's a great question, and that's a use case where I think you made this point maybe before we started recording, where I think crypto can be especially interesting. So I've thought about this a lot. One idea I've kind of come across is that you find in, especially on the aspect of affordability, when it comes to housing, it mostly does not come from the construction cost to build new housing. It comes in some way from land, either the value of land or the restrictions on what you can build on certain pieces of land. And this is a well kind of laid out argument, but my kind of position is that if you want to solve issues with housing, it does not make a lot of sense to be thinking about construction, because construction is, there might be some innovations there, and I could be completely wrong about this, but the bulk of the cost of construction is simply in the materials it takes to build it. And it's proven very difficult for any company to achieve any kind of significant cost savings. And when you look at big cities, it's not, real estate in San Francisco can be easily 10 times as expensive as it is here, but it's not 10 times as expensive to, to hire the people to build the building and to get the materials. It's mostly the land value that's the question there. So part of me thinks that there's an answer here in the way we treat land ownership, whereas today it's, you have private individuals, you subdivide land and give land to private, or sell land to private individuals, and they trade it back and forth amongst themselves and build things on it. But we found that kind of causes a lot of problems. And this is a lot of the thinking of Henry George, where he traces the boom and bust cycles in the economy generally to land speculation specifically, and says that until you fix the way land is valued and treated and owned, you can't really, you're going to get really, really expensive cities where they continue to get more expensive, wages can't keep up, and people are kind of priced out of those markets. In short, I guess my opinion is that the right kind of ownership of cities is one where the land value is held in common by the residents who live in that city. And you absolutely need private use of land, which you can accomplish through a land lease system. But it's important that the value of the land is held equally, or not equally, people can adjust their exposure, but is held in common by all residents as a requirement to live there. That way, everyone kind of benefits from the value they contribute by living there, by going about their day there, which is significant value. But instead of it being appropriated by a couple, private landowners, it's shared among all the people who live there.
Yeah, thanks for that. Maybe could you talk about why that's helpful in the context of what I believe you've coined, the tragedy of the privates? Like, how is the shared ownership of a city able to help overcome things like NIMBYism?
Yeah, for sure. I love that you said that out loud, because when I was writing that, I was like, this is just such a silly name, but I've got to use it for that reason. Obviously, very tongue in cheek. But yeah, you find, so there's a lot of discussion right now about, well, I guess always has been, but there's a lot of discussion about, to solve America's housing crisis, we need to build more housing. Well, why can't we build more housing? Well, zoning and permitting laws are really restrictive. It's really hard to get approval for new construction, and that's 100% true. And then on top of that, there's a lot of red tape and bureaucracy. But then you get to the point where you need the approval of all the people living in an area, and it's like that's when the real trouble starts. So this is the famous like NIMBY argument of people just usually say, "Oh, I'm in favor of like growth and new development and that kind of thing," but yeah, not in my backyard. and as long as it's not near me and doesn't affect me in any way. And there's a lot of different, you can make different arguments for why people behave that way, but they do almost, in every scenario. And when you think about why that is, it's not immediately obvious. It does kind of make sense. So like most people own a single piece of land. They have virtually their entire net worth tied up in this single, extremely illiquid, obviously immovable asset, usually with like a really big mortgage attached to it. And the thing about debt is that you really don't want anything to change for good or for bad. You want to smush like the entire distribution as much to the middle as you can. You just don't want anything weird happening, anything to change really. So that kind of makes sense to me. I mean, again, the impulse is like pretty understandable. Where I think and that is, to me in a way, kind of the tragedy of like private ownership, especially pernicious in cities where land values are so high. And again, you have to finance it with debt just to be able to afford housing there. So you have these really, really big mortgages on essentially high land values. The way I think you could solve that, so then people's kind of first reaction is like, hey, I'm going to oppose any new development because I don't want anything changing or going wrong for me. But when you think about that, the way that I think could kind of flip that dynamic on its head is if you do have a system where land is held in common by all residents of a city, because then instead of feeling the negative effects of new construction, like you feel all the negative effects, but you don't really feel any of the positive effects in the current system. You do get a bigger tax base in your area. It's maybe more culture and more job opportunities and things like that, but none of it benefits you directly. Whereas the new construction next to your house, you see every day, and it's really annoying, and you're worried about how it's going to affect your property value and all that. Well, if you're in a situation where land value is shared or held, the land is held in common by residents, then that dynamic completely flips on its head, because all of a sudden there's a direct financial incentive for every resident of the city to build as much new housing as they can generate demand for. And so it kind of like, I guess, does away with that whole issue, because they're not trying to guard their tiny little piece of earth from anything changing. They're thinking they're incentive. It's not about how they think; it's about the incentives. But they're incentivized because they own value, or they own a claim on the value of the land as a whole, rather than their tiny piece of land. So that to me is like, I think, an interesting argument, because I think all the discussions about policy somewhat miss the point, because policy emerges as a result of the people who live in a place. It's not like this thing that is just cast down from on high. It's like a result of people living there and making these choices based on the way land ownership is treated today. So anyway, I think ultimately trying to say, change policy, I don't think it'll work. Frankly, I don't think that's the solution. It might work a little bit in a couple cases, but overall that's not really going to change anything, because those people who, again, have those same incentives, the incentives haven't changed. They're going to push back and try to keep it the way it is. So
Right. Like, so everything you're saying is very aligned with how we think at Cabin, right? We want to incentivize people that are part of Cabin to own the collective network, to all share in the upside of the growth of our network of neighborhoods that we have across the world. And like what you're describing is this positive sum game of, hey, let's all benefit when the neighborhood collectively improves. And then you don't have people who, don't want their tiny piece of the neighborhood to improve, because there's like this supply side way that actually like affects the price of their asset negatively when it's their like one precious thing. So really appreciate that explanation, and want to sort of frame you as this neighborhood developer, which is, I think, in line with Cul-de-sac, who we've had on, and other projects that we've talked to. So I want to ask you questions about like how one develops a neighborhood from the ground up, but maybe let's do that in the context of West Village. So what is West Village, and what are you working on in your home of Florence?
yeah. So the catalyst, I guess, for this project came from two directions kind of at once. So one, there was this site where I live, actually in the neighborhood where my wife Sophie and I live, and it was formerly a hospital that was demolished, and us included, but everyone in the neighborhood was like, hey, what's going to go there? And being super interested in urban design and things like that, I was like, hey, I can see kind of the perfect thing here, or what would make a good addition to the neighborhood and to the city as a whole. So there was that, but then also that was kind of at the same time I was developing this line of thinking of like, hey, millions of people in the US now can choose where they want to live separately from what they do to earn a living. So if you can offer a compelling value proposition in the form of a neighborhood that's just, frankly better than a lot of what else is in the United States, then I think you could do pretty well. So that informed the design of the site in a big way. So West Village is like a new neighborhood center for this kind of, it's hard to show without a map, but like for the part of Florence just west of downtown. So it's an area that has a lot of existing housing already, but simply has no kind of center for any of that activity to congregate in. So we've designed a site to be that center. It has all the things that, in my opinion, a great neighborhood should have. It's very walkable and bikeable. It's at a human or a pedestrian friendly scale, yet has enough density to provide vitality and a lot of activity. It's proximate to everything. It's within the existing kind of urban fabric of the downtown Florence area. So it's very close to the historic part of downtown. It's very close to the university, which is just crossed 10,000 students. It's proximate to everything, but it also kind of contains most of your daily needs within, maybe not within that neighborhood, but definitely within a 15-minute walk or a 5-minute bike ride to anywhere downtown.
Yeah, speaking my language, listeners will know that I only have a bike and no other way to get around. So you talk about a little bit like, what are the table stakes of this new kind of neighborhood that is walkable, it's beautiful, your daily needs are met nearby. But you also talk about worshiping the small business owner. So yeah, can you talk about like why the small business owner is so important, and maybe also share like in the context of like what is the larger state of American retail?
Yeah, for sure. Well, so first of all, the reason I've kind of come to believe that, and it has evolved over time, is because once you learn about what kind of makes for a healthy neighborhood, you very quickly realize, and once you've visited a lot of different, some healthy, some unhealthy neighborhoods, you start to realize very quickly that the thing that makes a neighborhood great is are the businesses and the daily kind of commercial activity that takes place there. Residents are important and necessary, but on their own, just having people living in housing is obviously not enough. That's the suburbs, or that's the suburban apartment complex. So you need this ingredient of activity, of commercial activity. And for like, gosh, maybe not 80, but close to it, 80 years in the US, that commercial development, most people think of that as being like the Walmarts and the really massive suburban like retail centers and things like that. But there hasn't been a lot of development focused exclusively on small business owners, which I think is really strange because it's so, the barriers to starting a small business today are extremely low. And more people are kind of quitting their jobs and being like, hey, I would rather own my own business, or I would rather at least do something else. So that kind of catalyzed that. And then you find out very quickly too that the traditional model of retail, like shopping center development, obviously you can't really use that because it's based on everyone driving. So you have to kind of think about and look at like works of Christopher Alexander and people like that who very clearly kind of explain what you need to do to create really, active, exciting, vital areas, which is you want smaller units, smaller commercial units. You want many of them. So you want to have a diversity of small businesses, just like you want diversity in an ecosystem. You don't want one or two species there. You want preferably 10 or 15 or 20. The more the better, really. And you want those things to all be mutually kind of dependent, and maybe not dependent, but reinforcing. You want the people coming for one business type also to walk over to the cafe or restaurant and that kind of thing. And it's kind of funny because this was the original idea of like how every neighborhood was built, was like you could just walk or bike to most daily needs. And then both Walmart and the mall kind of took that idea and made it auto dependent. But ultimately, I'm of the belief I don't think that's really the future we want to build. I think we want to build more of not replicating the past, but trying to copy the things the past, did get right, which in my opinion is having relatively compact neighborhoods with plenty of residents, but also plenty of neighborhood serving small businesses. And the reason we worship them is because to most developers, it's like, hey, the commercial tenant is just a means to generate my return. Like I don't care if it's a bank, I don't care if it's a Chipotle, just get in there and pay me rent. Like I really don't care. Well, I care as long as you don't go bankrupt, which means they typically don't like small businesses. But that just to me doesn't make any sense because if you acknowledge that that's kind of the heart of the neighborhood, what gives the neighborhood life, then the developer should be working hard to make things good for the small business, not the other way around. So that's kind of where that conclusion came from. But and I kind of touched on your second question about what is the state of American retail today.
Well, you have a great stat. Like Europe has 2.5 square feet of retail space per capita. The US has 23.5 square feet of retail space per capita. That's almost an entire order of magnitude, 10x difference. I'm curious, like, as a neighborhood developer, what are the tangible steps you're taking to counteract that?
Yeah, so retail, I don't think there's any doubt about it, has been dramatically overbuilt. In well, okay, maybe not overbuilt is the right word, but there is certainly, like you said, an order of magnitude more in the United States than there is in Europe. So it's like it's interesting to look at what kind of causes that. But my I think most of the reason is simply we've had, almost a century now, or maybe 80 years, 70, 80 years of extremely, our country practically grew. Most of its kind of maturing phase was during the era of the car. And so all the retail that was built was with that kind of mode of life in mind. And I don't it's a good question and something I mulled over a lot of like, well, but should you really be building more retail? And I think ironically the answer is yes, because you're not building the same type of retail. Like in that statistical report, it's true they're both on paper kind of the same thing, but if you're a person on the ground living within a 5 minute walk or whatever or bike ride of the neighborhood center, that neighborhood center feels very different to you than a Walmart. It's not like those two things are equivalent. So I do believe if you, and I've seen this firsthand here in Florence. I mean, we have three other kind of neighborhood centers that are all doing very well and have very robust kind of small business retail spaces. The only reason we have that is because those were built a long time ago and are now being redeveloped and used again. But yeah, I do see those as like kind of two different classes of like retail or commercial use.
Yeah. Given that you still think new retail should be built, what should we do with all of the old retail, like with the different shops that are going out of business or like just have been replaced by with e-commerce? Like what should we do with the spaces that we're going to have in strip mall America?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. Like, and it's already happened. I guess in a lot of ways it already has happened because like our town, like a lot of others, has what is practically an abandoned mall. And I think malls were kind of like the first thing to go, the first like type of like really dedicated suburban retail to go. But I mean, in city after city, malls are just being either abandoned or basically they have like two tenants left in them. I mean, it's not good. What to do with them is a totally other question. I mean, they need to be redeveloped somehow because it's typically very valuable land, and a lot of them are of the scale that they are large enough to be their own kind of town or certainly a large neighborhood. But I don't think there's any one size fits all approach there. Like there is a good project in Huntsville here that I think is a former mall, but they've kind of developed it into it's more of a traditional or like kind of suburban redevelopment into like a Top Golf, and like they have a couple big suburban stores in it. But that's largely because Huntsville is a giant suburb anyway, so like they kind of have to do that. But there are good models across the country, especially of like turning some of them into housing. But it's not easy because you really have to do it on a case by case basis.
Sure, yeah, there's only so many old like Abercrombie and Fitch stores that can become trampoline malls.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
the okay, so given that there's going to be all kinds of property and retail that could be rehabbed into these like cool neighborhoods like cul-de-sac or like West Village, let's just get like super tactical into like the steps one a neighborhood developer like yourself has to go through in order for that project to be possible? So like, what's first? Is it zoning? Is it funding? Like, what's the sequencing that you've had to go through, and then maybe what would you have done differently?
Yeah, for sure. So I'll walk through kind of the process on this project just because it's concrete and easy and that kind of thing. Because a lot of developers, they'll start with some kind of like template or idea in their head, and they'll do a site search. They'll look for the right place to do that thing. But in our case, we have site already, so we immediately set to work thinking through what does the site need and call for. And there's a lot of like kind of like nitty gritty stuff you do in due diligence, like you do topographic surveys and geotechnical surveys to see what the soil quality is. Topos locate all the utility lines and easements and that kind of thing, the boundaries of the property, adjoining properties, and that kind of thing. Environmental surveys are all, that's all part of the kind of initial due diligence before you decide if you're going to do it. But once you've kind of decided that, I mean, you have to put together a team. A lot of people have folks they work with project to project, the same people. Some people do it on a deal by deal basis. It really depends. But the really big ones are like the architect, because or site planner / architect. They can be different, or they can be the same firm. As you probably know, and I've talked to Phil about, we use Opticos Design, and they're a great, like, they do both. They do site planning and architecture, and they're just really, really nice and friendly and fun to work with and stuff. But then you have all your lawyers, your civil engineer, your geotechnical engineer, you need accountants, you need, God, there's so much. Your pre-construction kind of advisor, who might be your general contractor. Then you have to find your general contractor. There's lots of like consultants and things like that you can bring in throughout the process, or have to bring in throughout the process. Landscape architect, that's a big one. But once you do that, and you kind of have to do all that simultaneously. I mean, you need to initially run like some rough numbers to know, like, hey, what kind of density can the site support? What does that mean for the overall unit count, and does that make for a profitable project? And then, yeah, like how much money am I going to have to raise? How much equity am I going to have to raise? How much debt will I need? Do I have an existing banking relationship? Do I want to work with them? That kind of thing. And you want to have a pretty good sense of that before you go into any detail, really start spending money on site planning and architecture and stuff. Because sometimes you can, to your point about zoning, sometimes if it's zoned, this isn't so much the case where I am, but I understand it's like, especially the case in California, if it's zoned for up to 8 units an acre or whatever, then like you're not going to get that changed. And so you can quit right there, basically. So it really depends. That part really depends on the jurisdiction, and in that case, you'd have to talk to like a land use attorney to tell you, hey, in this area, like, in California, I think it's just hard to do anything about that, or it's a long process. But yeah, you'd want to get definitely advice there. Basically, being a good developer is just about how the quality of the people you work with. I mean, that's really all it is. Is like how good they are, how much you enjoy working with them. If you want to enjoy your work, that I find that pretty important, and yeah, how much you trust them. So
Yeah, I would say that you're probably right in that working with people that you like is a good idea. I certainly feel that way at Cabin.
I was just gonna say, yeah, that was something my dad always said, is if you're not having fun, then like, what the fuck are you doing? Like, why are you spending your time on it? And I very strongly agree with that.
Yeah, amen. What is the entity funding the West Village, and does that entity or collection of entities, whatever it is, intend to see a profit, or is there this other intention to sort of give ownership to residents eventually? How do you think about that?
Yeah, so actually, like, that's another. I'm glad you brought that up, because like, I believe one really important part of a healthy neighborhood that I forgot to mention earlier is you not only want a diversity of like housing types, so you want people to, if they don't need a lot of floor space, then give them a studio apartment option that costs like basically very little in rent, all the way up to 2-bedroom apartments. But then a healthy neighborhood also has other housing types of different sizes for people in different phases of life. So and I'll kind of invert that by saying the worst type of neighborhood is, or I guess maybe the least healthy, in my opinion, is like the one that is like all exactly the same type of home. It's exactly, it's the massive suburban field with like, they're all 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, 1,700 square feet or somewhere thereabouts. There's builders will use like 3 floor plans and they'll rotate them and kind of make it, try to make it feel diverse or whatever. But that really just ends up creating like, I almost feel like you'd be better just actually stamping them out, because like then you're at least being honest. When you try to do the diversity with like 3 floor plans, then you end up with like an uncanny valley thing where it's like you can tell it's not right, but like you maybe can't put your finger on it, and it just makes you feel really uncomfortable just being there. Anyway, off that soapbox. But yeah, about the ownership. So that's one thing I see a lot is like a lot of developers don't have the flexibility to offer different either offer different housing types or offer different types of housing. And by that, I mean like for sale versus for rent. Whereas that is typically you find a really important part of a healthy neighborhood. Typically, it's not good to be all rental or all sold. And a lot of developers like to do that because it's just easy. Again, they have a template and they're working with an institutional investor, and it's like, hey, we're on a timeline, we're on a schedule, we gotta earn this 8% unlevered return or whatever it is so we can make our LPs happy. Their goals are different, I guess, is the point. So they do a very different style of development. But we were very intentional. I mean, we'll have, I think, about 60 units that will be sold, and those are all a blend of, we have some very small footprint, like single family, that are like starter homes essentially, which are very uncommonly built today. We have like some duplexes, which are really popular, with a lot of situations. If you have an aging parent, or if you want to live next to a friend, or if you just want to, rent it out as like a short-term rental or a monthly rental, and kind of be a small-time property owner. And then we have some more like traditional single family that kind of help tie the new neighborhood into the old, because we are building on an infill site. So there's some context that we're mindful of as well.
Gotcha. And then just to be clear, the entity doing the developing, is this an organization that is coalition built, or is this your personal company? Just help me understand that piece.
Oh yeah, it's just me.
Cool. Gotcha. Awesome. Well, yeah, I guess sort of one last fun comment, only because you've brought up biking and I'm a big biker. You wrote how electric cars are a painkiller, not a treatment. And I think that's a really astute observation. You say the US doesn't have a gas car problem. It has a car problem. If every car on the road today became electric, it might improve one type of emissions. I think it would, but it will not fix the fundamental issue with the way most cities in our countries are laid out. So we need new ways of thinking about building and development. I think that's a great framing for this whole conversation that we've just had. And so you've traded your electric car for an e-bike. Just thoughts on like how that experience has been, and then also what is the Dorman's fallacy? How does that relate?
Yeah. Yeah, so that post was inspired. Like for a while, I've commuted by bike to the office every day because we live like maybe a mile and a half away. But it's really pleasant here. Like it's there's not a lot of traffic. It's like really nice to ride your bike every day. And my wife is Dutch, by the way. So that's kind of how I got into the whole bike riding thing, is like visited the Netherlands, and like I was like, wow, like everybody rides their bike here like all the time. And I was like, how do they do this? And then kind of went down that rabbit hole, and you find, hey, it's like very, very intentional choices they made. It's not just an accident. So that kind of got me thinking about, well, how do you bring more of that here? How do you make those choices here? Yeah. So first of all, I started commuting by bike, and then we had 2 cars, like most American households with 2 or more people. And then one day we were like kind of talking. We were like, hey, my car had, like, I hadn't driven it, I think, in like 2 months or something. And I was kind of like, this is just ridiculous. Like, why do I have this thing here? We should just sell it. And then I also like investing. So I was like, well, what if we sell it and like invest all the money? And then like, what will that mean for us at retirement? Because you're buying like a $1,000 electric bike to replace it. So obviously it's a net win on that front. But what does it mean like for you long term? So yeah, anyway, I finally, I guess, convinced her. We agreed we'd try it out. And it's been amazing, because we were like, oh, well, trying to think of what all could go wrong. And we're like, well, what if you have a meeting at this end of town and I have a meeting at that end of town? And I was like, okay, one of us takes an Uber. That's like super easy to do, and it costs like $10. Or like, what if it's raining really hard and we both have meetings? Because that, again, that's also uncommon, that we both have meetings out of the house at the exact same time. But we're like, what if it happened? And that one, I was like, I'll just take one for the team. I'll get a rain jacket, and I'll make sure I'll be the one biking in the rain. Don't worry about it. So that was how that played out. And it's been, I guess, like 6 months now or so since we actually sold the car. But I've been commuting my bike for like a year, and I love it. I mean, yeah, it's such an easy part of my daily routine. And you really like, I heard someone make this comment the other day, but you connect to the world really differently when you're on a bike or on foot versus when you're on a car. And so, like, I know more people in my neighborhood now. I see all kinds of people downtown when I ride my bike, and it's just overall, it's just 10 out of 10 experience. Would do again if given the chance.
Same. What's the doorman's fallacy?
So I have to give credit. I just read about this in Rory Sutherland's book Alchemy, which is a really really fantastic book. I've read it, or I listened to it actually on Audible because he narrates it himself. And it's just, I find it super entertaining to listen to. But anyway, he talks about this idea how if you replace like in a nice residential building like in New York, a lot of them have doormen, and over the years, a lot of clever landlords have said, "Hey, we're going to fire the doorman who we have to pay $40,000 a year in salary, and we're going to spend $20,000 on an automatic door opener, and then we save that money every year as long as we don't have the doorman." And Rory's point is like that's a, well, maybe not a mistake to make that decision, but it's not as simple as it first appears, which is on the surface, the role of the doorman is to open the door, but that's not the only thing he's doing. That's not the only function he performs. It's the only one he performs if you're only reasoning through an economic lens that you can identify any value to, because you can take that one specific function and automate it, and you've solved your problem. You saved the money and that kind of thing. But his point is like, that's not all the doorman's there for. He's there to greet people in the building, to know them on a first name basis, to receive packages, to make people feel safe, to keep riffraff away from the building or whatever it is, keep the people in the building feel safe. And he was like, it wouldn't surprise me if his overall the value he adds to the building overall is higher than the money you would save if you put a automatic door opener in. But that's not at all obvious on the surface. So I think it's a good warning about being overly rational in economic calculation. And that to me is a lot of what it feels like the United States did during the 20th century with automotive infrastructure is, hey, we're going to create much faster roads. In theory, it's like, in a car, you can travel at an average of 45 miles an hour. That's like, like you said, an order of magnitude better than traveling at 3 or 4 miles an hour on foot. But that's not the only thing you're changing. Like, your transportation speed is not the one true thing that matters in the world. And there's a great line from Jeff Speck's book Walkable City where he says basically over the 20th century we made places that are very very easy to get to and from, but not worth ever arriving at. So like there's no there when you get there. You drive through the suburbs and there's nothing there. And there's a lot of entire cities like this, especially in like the Southwest and like, parts of Florida and stuff where there was no development before the car. It's just like you go there and it's like, but where is it? Like where's the center? Where's so anyway, it's like, although it might be more efficient along one dimension, that's not the only consideration that should be made. So, and obviously that's an oversimplification. There were a lot of reasons the United States did the things it did. So I'm not trying to say that's like some guy was like, oh, let's just make nice, pretty straight roads everywhere. Obviously it was more complicated than that, but it's a good lesson just to think about when making those kinds of decisions.
Well, here's to building more places worth arriving at. Joel Anderson, thank you so much for coming on the show. Where can people follow you? We'll plug the Jambalaya Substack in the opening, but like any call to action, place you want to send listeners?
Oh yeah, thanks. So I'm on Twitter and I try to, be somewhat kind of active on there, and it's just Joel Anderson with 3 underscores because I got tired of having the numbers after my name. So it looks a little weird, but that's it. There's no call to action right now. We're probably about a month away from having like a real public announcement and having a website live and that kind of thing for West Village. We're finally at the point in the process we're ready to do that. And honestly, I would love just to, even if folks, obviously if anyone wants to move there, I would love to talk to them. But even if they're not, I would just love to get thoughts and feedback and ideas on the concept and on the neighborhood. Because this is, the first kind of big project of this kind for us, but it certainly will not be the last. So I'm hell bent on building more places that people actually want to live in rather than feel stuck living